opposition side, we also want ASEAN to evolve, but we want it to happen at a safer pace. Right now, the priority of the ASEAN nations is to stabilize their own countries, especially when they've gone through ASEAN integration. Now, if we directly engage with their assertion that we're just, in the worst case, trying to be concerned with merely the economic concerns, we think that it's still justifiable. Why? Because in the first place, the economic concerns are the reasons why they banded together in the first place. If you don't attend to these concerns by these developing countries, you run the risk of them saying that this particular group is tokenistic, and you run the risk of them making and forging strategic alliances outside the ASEAN, which directly dissolves the power of them being a bloc. But moreover, we think it's important for you to prioritize these economic concerns because it's the more urgent issue that they have to prioritize. Moreover, these particular countries are developing countries. They're not even that stabilized yet in terms of the free labor movement that is as a result of the ASEAN integration, for example, especially when majority of your members are not like Singapore, for example, which can handle that. That's why, even if we have to defend that they're just purely for economic concerns, that we don't want to abandon these principles, we think that that's okay. But moreover, I have several issues to discuss in my speech. Number one, is there really a moral obligation? And secondly, and more importantly, can ASEAN really handle it? However, let's respond first because there are two different characterizations. ASEAN countries want it, this particular abandonment, and ASEAN countries don't want it. We think that it's more likely for us to happen in the characterization of the opposition side, considering that Kate has already successfully characterized that there are political differences among and between these countries, and it's more likely for these countries to not agree with any intervention, especially when you force ASEAN to collectively decide upon it. But moreover, in terms of moral obligation, just because the ASEAN knows and lives and breathes these particular issues, doesn't mean it's already right for you to intervene. That's exactly the point. When these ASEAN countries are directly affected, these countries are more likely to be not be willing to accept refugees, for example, because they are developing countries. Or for example, even if there are no differences at all, that means that you don't need to abandon because there's no need for you to compel them, or there's no need for you the power to compel in the first place. So the point is, this debate happens where these ASEAN countries do not agree with each other, especially when you're talking about intervention, a violation of national sovereignty. We think that this particular respect, or this level of respect for national sovereignty, is what sets ASEAN apart from EU. That's why EU is now currently breaking apart because of the Brexit and the Brexit issue, for example. It's because of their aggravating violations of national sovereignty, which does not take into consideration the differences in these between and among these countries. But moreover, in the first issue, is there really a moral obligation? Because the only reason coming from the government side why there is a moral obligation is because the ASEAN has the interest to protect internal order. There was no discussion of why this particular internal order would automatically come into place just because he abandoned the non-interventionist policy. But their best example is at Myanmar. For example, we have to accept refugees and all of those things. Number one, we have already provided to you different alternatives, like you have the UN and other international bodies which could intervene and help those other countries who are in need. But moreover, if this particular need is very, very compelling, then you can strike multilateral and bilateral agreements to accept refugees, for example. Or for example, when they want to talk about the South China Sea dispute, not all countries are involved in the ASEAN countries. Therefore, if you don't abandon this non-interventionist policy, you give these ASEAN countries a leeway to not be able to participative in those kinds of discussions and not involve their own countries. But furthermore, let's clarify, if these countries can veto still through the unanimous decision making, so on both houses, a rift is possible. On government, you isolate and gang up and meddle into one country, and in opposition, you bar these countries from intervening, even if the need is very compelling, because of the non-interventionist policy. Why is it still better on our side? This is because it's a collective agreement that you reach upon the non-intervention. You have that in your charter, for example, as the ASEAN nation. But on their side, you make it an active choice because you give them an opportunity to intervene, but they don't. That's why you run the risk of trying to harm those countries because you deliberately and actively decided that you won't intervene in the first place. But second issue,
context as ASEAN. This is where we prove the exclusive characteristics of ASEAN that justify why they can't abandon their non-interventionist policy. We told you, coming from our constructive speakers, that ASEAN is still transitioning. This means that their concern right now is in terms of economic movements, economic concerns, and stabilizing their own countries. This means that it's in their best interest to not be a threat to their members. Why is the number important? Their number as an ASEAN country is where they derive their power. Their collective and unanimous decision-making, especially through this unanimous and collective decision-making, is where we ensure everyone's willingness and ability to cooperate in whatever decision the ASEAN makes. If you don't have this particular characteristic in ASEAN, you run the risk of making mistrust among the countries, which forces them to make other alliances outside the ASEAN, which could even create a gridlock between them, especially when they want to protect China's interests, for example, or they want to protect Japan instead. Number two, this is also a recipe for them taking their first few steps towards a greater imbalance. What do I mean by this? EU, for example, does not have this particular non-interventionist policy. That's why when they do have the decision making, there's a great imbalance between Germany and Greece, for example. When you always oppress these other weaker countries within your nations through this non-interventionist policy, you even greaten that imbalance, and that's why they have this Brexit issue. If you always take into consideration every single country's decision making, we think that you always protect the respect for national sovereignty by these particular ASEAN nations. And we think that in terms of protecting the internal order, that particular maintenance is very, very important. Thank you.